Good evening, everyone. It's a welcome opportunity to be able to speak on bringing back homes, the manual for the reuse of existing buildings. As you said, the document has been out for some time now. It was published originally as part of Rebuilding Ireland, Pillar 5, an examination of vacant homes with a view to bringing our underused and underutilized buildings back into use. Whether the buildings are vacant or partially vacant, they can be put to use as dwellings, what is termed as the low-hanging fruit, which is ultimately has the ultimate objective of providing access to housing. It of course also has the benefit of revitalizing our towns, our villages, and our urban centres. Bring It Back Homes was designed to create guidance to navigate the various permissions and requirements that can exist, that taken as a group can often seem to be unwieldy, but broken down into their constituent parts and become a little bit more manageable. To navigate the permissions that are available, to clarify the requirements in respect of building regulations. And on that particular topic, there was a great deal of examination in respect of all of the requirements of the building regulations. And the information was included in the appendix, one of the appendices to BBH, to provide that clear guidance in the manual for the reuse of our buildings. I'll go into that in some detail as part of tonight's seminar. The document also contains information on planning permission requirements, financial incentives and supports, information on other important legislative requirements that can come into effect before, during and after works have been carried out to a building. Legislation like the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act, the Fire Services Act, the Minimum Standards and Rental Accommodation Regulations. All to a view to provide property owners, members of the public, local authorities and those involved in the construction industry with clear guidance on how current regulatory requirements apply to the common existing building types. In order to navigate the particulars and the finesse of the requirements of the building regulations, specific building types were identified and simple, straightforward guidance provided with respect to reuse options. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I hope to go through the document to highlight the certain provisions of it, to provide examples of the application of the building regulations to the various reuse options, to look at some of the high-level requirements respect to Part B and fire safety in respect of the works, as well as some more detailed matters relating to Part B in respect of existing buildings. The document structures itself into what is termed as the basic process, 5 key steps in the reuse of existing buildings. The first step is to assess the particular buildings, to look at the condition of the buildings, what state is it in terms of repair, what heritage value does the building have, what are its potential uses, and for that 4 key types of buildings termed the low-hanging fruit were identified with a number of reuse options. What incentives and grants are available, and what are the likely costs of the proposed works, and will the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act and its requirements apply? Key to all of this is a fundamental understanding of the issues at hand in respect of the existing building, to carry out that existing building assessment, to understand what needs to be done in respect of the building regulations. Step 2 in BBH is identifying the regulatory path. Do the works require planning permission? Do they qualify for an exemption under the Exempted Development Regulations 2018 for the reuse of buildings into dwellings? Do the works require a fire safety certificate? And do the works require a disability access certificate? If we look at the initial approach in respect of buildings, there's 12 parts to the building regulations. It can be tempting to look at a single technical guidance document. I'm sure that part B of the building regulations is something that's is often looked at in the initial respects to an existing building or to its reuse to determine the technical and regulatory requirements in respect of the reuse of buildings. But before looking at the TGDs, it's important to look at the nature of the works. What is actually happening in the building? Is the work, does it constitute a material alteration where the works or part of the works would have a requirement on part A, B, or M, A being structure, B fire safety, and M access and use to the building regulations? It's key to understand what exactly a material alteration is in respect of an existing building, that the works drive the requirement in material alteration. It's only to the works that the requirements of the building regulations, to the relevant building regulations, will apply. But in doing those works, there should be no new or greater contravention of the building regulations. Another key requirement of SI 497, the building regulations 1997. There may already exist in an existing building what could be termed as a contravention when we compare it with our current requirements. If there is, it should not be made worse. There should be no new contravention in the existing building. In respect of material change of use, which is distinctly different to that of material alteration and can often come into play in terms of the reuse of buildings options. Material change of use applies to the applicable parts of the building. Again, it's important to remember and review the likes of the Building Control Act in carrying out works, that a building is defined as a building or part of a building, so that when we talk about material change of use, it can apply to a whole building or part of it. And therefore, in having regard to the particular works, the requirements, the relevant requirements of the building regulations can apply to a whole building or part. In respect of material change of use, parts A1 and A2, all of part B, B1 through to B11, C4, E, F, G, H, J, and L apply to the part that is undergoing the material change of use. There's a distinct requirement when it comes to access and use in respect of existing buildings and material changes of use. Part M does not by itself apply to the change of use under Section 3.3 of the Building Control Act, as it's not listed under Article 13.1a of the building regulations. That means that in carrying out the works, there's no requirement to bring the works up to the requirements of TGDM. However, there's a specific nuance in respect of material alterations in an existing building to facilitate the material change of use. If some works in connection with the change of use are carried out and those works on their own are subject to the requirements of A, B, or M, they constitute a material alteration. And such, it's those works would have to comply with Part M. And every part of the building affected by the works, but only to the extent that they would not cause a new or greater contravention. So in the case of a material change of use of a dwelling, Part M does not impose a requirement to upgrade the approach route or provide, for example, passenger lifts for vertical circulation in a building. But if it's decided to alter the routes or provide such a lift, then they themselves, those elements which carry a requirement under Part M, must comply with the applicable requirements of TGDM. In respect of the regulatory path, and it can often be difficult to apply these requirements in the absence of specific worked examples. For that reason, Bringing Back Homes did identify, as I said earlier, the 4 building types, which translated into 13 reuse options. And going through these reuse options, we can start to navigate and apply the particular requirements of the building regulations. The type 1 building, simple and straightforward existing dwelling, which can be found in many of our villages and towns, has 2 reuse options, that of a refurbishment, option A, or option B, the conversion of a dwelling into two dwellings. In respect of the refurbishment, it's a material alteration where there are works carried out to the building. There may be specific works in terms of the reuse option, updating linings or providing additional insulation to improve the energy performance of the building. Replacement of doors and windows will carry a requirement under the certain parts of the building regulations. But there's no requirement for planning permission, as there's no change of use. A fire safety certificate, as it's a dwelling, was a dwelling and will remain to be a dwelling, is not required. And a disability access certificate is not required for a dwelling house. It's important to note that where any dwelling undergoes a major renovation, the minimum energy performance requirement of the dwelling or the renovated part is upgraded in order to meet the cost optimal levels of energy performance insofar as it's technically, functionally and economically feasible. In respect of the conversion of a dwelling into two dwellings, that's a defined material change of use under the Building Control Act. As the single dwelling is being divided into occupationist or into two separate dwellings for separate occupation, a fire safety certificate would be required for the dwelling, the whole dwelling, as it constitutes a material change of use. But under the requirements under the building control regulations, a disability access certificate is not required for such a change of use. Moving on to type 2, the two-story building with over-the-shop accommodation. It sounds similar. There are similar reuse options. It is assumed in the reuse option that the over-the-shop accommodation, the shop itself, is ancillary to the main use of the dwelling, that the shop and the dwelling are indistinguishable from each other, that they're owned and operated by the same individual. So that inclusion of the ancillary shop as part of the dwelling is a material alteration. The shop is part of the dwelling. It's only been repurposed as part of a dwelling. And again, there may be certain works carried out to repurpose the shop. For example, the construction of a wall to subdivide the ground floor area or further subdivide it. It's those elements would carry the requirement in respect of the building regulations. Option B, the conversion of an ancillary shop to an independent shop with a dwelling overhead, an existing dwelling, and that's an important characteristic. That the dwelling was a dwelling, it still continues to be a dwelling. The shop is the element being separated. So the shop is the element to which the material change of use applies. The fire safety certificate is required in respect of the shop, as is a disability access certificate for the shop, as is the shop is the subject of the works. And similar to type 1, option C of type 2 is the conversion of an ancillary or independent shop to an independent dwelling unit with another dwelling overhead, each of which types would be a material change of use and therefore would require a fire safety certificate. Moving on to reuse type 3, a 3-story building with over-the-shop accommodation. Option A is similar to the type 2 building, as is option B, similar to the type 2, where the ancillary shop is converted to an independent shop. In terms of option C, the ancillary independent shop is converted to an independent dwelling with multiple dwellings overhead. So the entire building is subject to the material change of use and a fire safety certificate. And the Part B requirements apply in respect of the whole building, as it does for reuse option D. For the retention of the shop or conversion of the ancillary shop to an independent shop and the creation of independent dwellings overhead. And finally, reuse option type 4, the multi-story building non-dwelling, for conversion to particular reuse options. In terms of the multi-story building, it's any multi-story building that is converted into the use of a dwelling. The diagrams show 3-story building, the imagery showing a 4, but it is any multi-story building converted. But the conversion of a non-dwelling to a dwelling carries a requirement for planning permission unless it's exempted development under the Exempted Development Regulations 2018. A fire safety certificate is not required for such a building because it's conversion to a dwelling. Fire safety certificates are not required in respect of dwellings, but the works would still carry a Part B requirement in respect of the building. To maintain a non-dwelling unit on the ground floor to create a 2-story dwelling overhead, requires a fire safety certificate for the whole of the building, as does converting the multi-story building, which is a non-dwelling building, into individual dwellings. It would be termed a building containing flats. Therefore, a fire safety certificate is required for the whole building, as it is if a non-dwelling is maintained at ground level and the remainder of the building is converted to use as dwellings. Moving on from the basic process, having identified the reuse options, bringing back homes further delves into the high-level requirements in respect of building regulations, identifying the key design work needed. For each of the reuse options, key design work in respect of compliance with the building regulations is identified. For example, in reuse type 2, reuse option B, the typical scale of interventions given for the type 2 building over the shop accommodation, conversion of an ancillary shop to an independent shop, includes the fire separation and sound insulation between the shop and dwellings, the provision of independent services, and the installation of integrated fire alarm system and replacement perhaps of windows. The rental regulations can apply in respect of a dwelling where that is proposed to be offered for rental following the conclusion of works. Similarly, same building, different process, that the shop has been converted to a dwelling with the dwelling overhead. That similar precautions will apply in respect of fire and sound insulation, independent services through the building. And moving through each of the reuse options, the typical interventions are provided at a very high level to identify the particular requirements which may apply, the likes of thermal insulation throughout a building, the likes of provision of an integrated fire alarm system where there's a common access areas in buildings. Further to the high-level observations and interventions in a building, Bringing Back Homes identifies 2 key buildings to provide detailed guidance with respect to the reuse options. In respect of Part B and fire safety considerations, you have to ask the first question, I suppose, in respect to the building: what works are applicable to the building regulations? In this particular option, type 3, the 3-story building with over the shop accommodation, reuse option B, the shop is being separated from the existing dwelling overhead. The works that are listed in the figure and associated table are in relation to the shop only. But it does identify the requirements in respect of the separating wall between the shop and any adjoining buildings, in terms of internal fire spread and internal spread of flame requirements, that the external wall, the fire resistance of the external wall is appropriate with respect to boundary conditions. The shop itself has to be separated from the dwelling areas by means of the appropriate sound insulation, that the requirements of Part E are met, and from any adjoining dwellings that may adjoin the shop itself. In terms of the external walls, looking at the shop, has there been any increase in unprotected area which may affect the fire spread across the boundary? Is the separating wall structurally sound? Are the floors and walls to the required fire resistance following the works? In the same way, looking at the same building, but particular and distinct reuse options, the type 3 building, the 3-story building with the over the shop accommodation, is repurposed as an independent shop with flats overhead. So again, the same questions in respect of application of the building regulations apply, but with different answers owing to the different reuse options. In terms of the external walls, it is all the external walls that are being looked at in respect of these options, as the material change of use applies to the whole building. Is there any increase in the unprotected areas? In fact, owing to the increased compartmentation in the building, it's likely that the external fire spread requirements to and from neighbouring buildings will be improved. In terms of the separating wall, is it structurally sound? Are there any openings or conduits or fire spread between this building and the next? Are the floors and walls separating the shop from the first floor dwelling unit and from the first floor dwelling unit to the second floor structurally sound? Do they have the appropriate protection with respect to fire and respect to sound insulation? Such a building may require the construction of a protected shaft to provide internal access to each of the individual units. Is there appropriate sound separation and fire separation between the common areas and the residential areas? How does the protected shaft interface with the rafters in the attic? And construction and detailing of that protected shaft to be carried to the underside of the roof above can be important in protecting the dedicated escape route from the individual dwellings. The flats will have their own requirements in respect of design to Technical Guidance Document B, with 5588 Part 1 providing guidance in respect of horizontal and vertical means of escape for flats. Such a building would require a new common integrated fire alarm system as defined and required under section 1.4.14.4 of Technical Guidance Document B, 2006 reprint 2020. The same common areas would require emergency lighting with dedicated domestic detection systems to each individual flat. Care and consideration needs to be taken in the separation of the services from such an existing building to dedicated services, electricity and water to each individual dwelling. Moving on from the high-level guidance and even the detailed guidance set out in bringing it back home with respect to existing buildings, I'd like to look at Technical Guidance Document B for a moment in respect of the detailed guidance and the applicable requirements set out in those technical guidance documents to buildings. First and foremost, the introductory text to each technical guidance document is the same, read as if the documents are to be considered as they are. A holistic suite of 14 documents designed to work together to achieve the functional requirements of the building regulations. They state equally in each TGD that the adoption of the guidance of the document without modification in respect of existing buildings may not in all circumstances be appropriate, that the adherence to the guidance, which is typically intended for application to new work, may be unduly restrictive or impractical. It's acknowledged that in that text that the TGDs are written with new builds and new extensions in mind, and there is recognition given for the difficulties in application to existing works, particularly material alterations and material changes of use. In respect of the means of escape requirements in TGDB, it goes further, as do many of the technical guidance documents, to further detail requirements in respect of existing buildings. In some of the technical guidance documents, such as L and M, there are specific sections with respect to existing buildings. In B, there are provisions and requirements with respect to existing buildings are found throughout the documents. But at the very start, in respect of means of escape, it is recognized that certain alternative documents or compensating measures may be applicable and appropriate in respect of existing buildings. Documents like the Guide for Practitioner 6 Conversion of Traditional Buildings by Historic Scotland, like the Architectural Heritage Protection Guidelines for Planning Authorities, published by the DAHG in 2011, and various other documents which may provide solutions to particular issues that can be found in existing buildings. In respect of material alterations to existing buildings, TGDB does specify certain other documents in the reuse of buildings, which are very specific and relevant to the reuse options for dwellings. For example, the material alterations, for material alterations to flats, the code of practice for fire safety in flats can be published by the National Directorate for Fire and Emergency Management can be used. There are particular provisions given for existing stairways, where the stairways are found to be combustible, provided that they can still continue to be used, provided that they serve the function appropriate to Technical Guidance Document B and comply with Part K requirements. In terms of the application of the technical guidance documents for means of escape, in respect of the refurbishment or material alteration of a dwelling, there should be no new or greater contravention in respect of the building regulations for such a dwelling, but that specific elements that undergo the material alteration to bring the building back into use have to conform to the provisions of Technical Guidance Document B 2017. Similarly, as with the Type 4 building reuse option A, the conversion of a dwelling into a single dwelling, the appropriate particular provisions of Technical Guidance Document B would apply to the works. In respect of the material change of use creating a flat, in terms of the use of Technical Guidance Document B 2006 and BS 5588 Part 1, where it's an outdoor flat, it's treated like a dwelling to 5588 Part 1. Where there are common areas in respect of the flats, again, the provisions of TGDB and 5588 Part 1 apply. The creation of a protected single stair within a protected shaft. Typically, in the smaller scale interventions, there would be no lobbies from the stairway to the particular individual dwelling units, where it's allowed under the guidance that there would be protected entrance hallways within each flat, fire alarms appropriate to Technical Guidance Document B, and other systems designed to facilitate and aid detection of fire and evacuation in such buildings. In looking at linings, under the current guidance, the erection to fire classifications are permitted to be S476 or can be classified to 13501-1. Moving on to requirements in respect of compartmentation in buildings, which can sometimes be challenging and difficult in the reuse options. In terms of the dwelling, it's important to identify any issues in respect of separating walls to ensure that they are fit for purpose and don't allow the transmission or spread of fire from one building to the other. In terms of flats, again, the reuse options are particularly relevant in this respect. In terms of compartment floors and compartment walls in such dwellings, the fire resistance requirements are determined by the height of the building. There's no restriction on the combustibility of compartment floors for existing buildings. That's a particular provision that is set out in TGDB, excluding institutional buildings, of course. Again, for internal walls, existing internal walls that are combustible are permitted subject to a maximum limitation of the height of the building set out in Section 3 of TGDB. For the particular enhancement or upgrade of the fire resisting floors in such buildings, Technical Guidance Document B does refer to the specific and detailed guidance that is set out in documents like BR 128 and Building Research Digest 208, where the specific build-ups and performances in those documents can be used to good effect under the prima facie guidance to Technical Guidance Document B. That certain thicknesses of plaster, for example, plaster on a 37mm joist, with 21 mil chipboard, a plaster thickness of 15 millimeters will give 30 minutes under VR 128, and various thicknesses of plasterboard on various thicknesses of joist will provide fire resistance between dwellings. It's important to consider in such works the provision of service zones to ensure that the services for each particular dwelling is carried within that dwelling, within its fire resisting barriers. In terms of the provision of unseen spaces and the provision of cavity barriers in buildings, more specifically to dwellings, but principles that are applicable to all buildings that are provided. There can be issues, particularly in 3-story dwellings, so where there's a 3-story or multi-story non-dwelling converted to a dwelling. There would, under Technical Guidance Document B 2017, be the requirement for a protected stairs, which must interface with which should more than likely interface with an attic space. Such a stairs, the attic would have to have similar protection in the attic spaces. Under TGB 17, the protection is provided either by cavity barriers on the line of the stairway in the attic, or the provision of a fire resisting ceiling to close the attic space. Where protective stairs is provided in such a building, we do have to consider the impacts of fire on the non-protected space. If there's a cavity barrier or continuation of the protective stairway enclosure in the attic, that a premature collapse of rafters doesn't affect the escape route. Similarly, for the creation of such dwellings, the thermal performance of the building is often improved by the inclusion of insulation on the inside face. On occasion, there can cause such certain difficulties in terms of the provision of fire spread in hidden spaces, that where insulation is added to the inside lines of a wall, be it a solid wall or any other type of wall, that there would be a continuation through the floor spaces. In this case, it's a solid floor, example of a solid joist floor, but with insulation running continuously from one floor to the next. The principles of separation of combustible insulation, where it does pass between or pass through an intermediate floor, were specified in both the acceptable construction details and in the supplementary guidance to Technical Guidance Document B 2017. Again, with respect to external walls, there's the requirements in respect of building regulations may already be met if there's no increase in unprotected area within the dwelling itself. It's again important to consider the implications of inclusion of additional combustible elements outside the face of the building and what that means for the external walls. In terms of the basic process, having looked at all of the provisions and the requirements in respect of the building regulations and what may be required to meet the requirements of the building regulations, we do have the next steps and stages in that basic process to confirm that the appropriate approvals are in place in respect of the buildings and the works before the works are carried out. Is planning permission required in respect of the works? Is a fire safety certificate applied or applicable? Has the application for such documents been lodged? Are there other specific permits required, or are there other restrictions in respect of the works that may need to be considered, such as the need to close a road in respect in order to enable works, to provide scaffolding, is there need for skips or other means to remove materials from the site as part of the works. Bringing back homes again, in looking at all of the reuse options as good examples, has provided guidance within the manual as to where the permissions are generally required, and in respect of specific works to parts of a building where specific permissions may be required. And that is set out for each of the reuse options within bringing back homes. Step 5 in the basic process is the final step along the paths in terms of commencing the works, not the final step in terms of concluding the works in compliance with the building regulations. Having received the permissions that may be necessary, if there are permissions necessary in respect of the works, that the appropriate notifications are provided before the works commence on site. Is a commencement notice required? And if so, what type of notice is required for the specific works? In terms of the type 1, 2, or 3, options A, no notice is required, as neither planning permission nor a fire safety certificate is required, and works can commence on site as desired. But even in the absence of formal notification of the commencement of works, it's important to remember that the building regulations still apply, or may still apply, in respect of material alterations. In respect of the type 4A, the conversion of a multi-story dwelling into a single dwelling, a commence notice without accompanying documentation is required. And for all other reuse options, a commence notice with accompanying documentation under SI 9 of 2014, traditionally termed BCAR, is required, as a fire safety certificate and planning permission is required. That means the application or the notification to the local authority of a commencement notice, which is then validated by the local authority once they have had a chance to review the particulars. And there are specific processes within the local authorities for validating of such notices. The submission of such commencement notice under SI 9 also requires the notification of an assigned certifier and a builder, and ultimately requires a certificate of compliance and completion to be lodged with the local authority via the BCMS prior to the operation or occupation or use of the building or part of the building to which the notice relates. Bringing back homes, in order to further promote the reuse options, does give certain examples where buildings have been brought back into use related to the various reuse options within BBH, to give insight information to provide examples of how such reuse options can be applied. Under the appendices for bringing back homes, there are specific provisions given and information in relation to the Exempted Development Regulations 2018 with a detailed overview of the provisions. There's information in relation to the application of the building regulations to works to existing buildings. As I said at the very start, there was a detailed look and examination in respect of the building regulations and works to existing buildings, and the information contained in the appendices can be incredibly useful. There's information there in relation to the minimum standards in rented accommodation, to the licenses that may be required, to assistance grants and incentives that were relevant, and to frequently ask questions that can and do often come up in respect of the reuse of existing buildings. In closing, the basis behind bringing back homes was a means to provide clear, simple and straightforward guidance in respect of the various reuse options, to provide clarity and information in respect of the reuse of existing buildings. Those objectives to reuse and revitalize our town, village and city centres were an important part of previous and current objectives of providing housing, that in Housing for All, Action 20.3 looks to continue the good work that was put into place, and that led to the creation of Bringing Back Homes. The guidance in it, even though it does go into a great amount of detail with respect to planning and permissions, with respect to incentives and grants, the guidance in relation to building regulations is very useful and is key irrespective of the type of works that occurs in the built environment. That is a distinct and detailed look at the requirements of the building regulations in respect of buildings, and can be very useful in applying them to works. In fact, finally, the provisions of it, sometimes when looking at a particular problem, a particular existing building for which there's a reuse option, it can seem unwieldy. But when you break down the particular steps and stages as set out in Bringing Back Homes, it can become that little bit more manageable, and will ultimately, hopefully, lead to the reuse of existing buildings in our built environment and the bringing of life and commerce back to our villages, towns and cities. The document is available for download at the link that's shown on the website, but it is available at housing.gov.ie or by a web search for Bringing Back Homes. Thank you for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much. That's been very informative, and thank you for your time for preparing and presenting. I think it's very timely to talk, because as the pandemic is coming to an end and we're all moving slowly back into our offices, we have over the last 2 years been living either away from our normal place or down the country, and we found we no longer need to be based in an office within a large urban combination. We could be down the country. So anything which we can do to revitalise, regrow, and just rekindle our rural towns and villages should be encouraged. We've received a few questions in. Earlier on in the presentation, you showed a number of the technical guidance documents in a row, like a pack of playing cards. One of the viewers keenly spotted that part K was missing. Was there any particular reason for that?
When you look at the building regulations, and in terms of any works to any building, it's important to start from the top being the Building Control Act, moving through the building regulations, before moving on to the building control regulations and the administrative system. But when you look at the requirements of the building regulations in respect of material change of use, there are certain parts that are applied in respect of material change of use, and they're set out in the building regulations under Article 13. But not all the parts are applicable to a material change of use. We do give an example of how Part M by itself is not applicable in the case of a material change of use where a flat becomes used, but that material alterations pursuant to Parts A, B and M in such a building may be applicable. So Part M specifically, I mean, Part B is always applicable to a material change of use. But there are certain parts that are not by themselves applicable in a material change of use. We do have to be careful of what constitutes the material alteration of elements. And parquet is a useful example. There's no requirement under the change of use to look at parquet, so you're not looking at parquet as directly applicable to the works. Most buildings will have an existing stairs. The stairs is existing, so it has to be safe. It has to be fit for purpose for its intended use. Part B will bring its requirements in respect of means of escape in the building, but the stairs is already there. It's an existing stairs, and there's no parquet requirement on the existing stairs in terms of material change of use. Bringing a new stairs in is new works, and that brings on its own distinct requirements. But it's not an omission from the slide. It's a reflection of the requirements of the building regulations when we look at a material change of use.
Okay. I kind of neatly segues into the second question, which was, why does the change of use stroke alterations into separate flats not require a DAC? Is it not in itself a material alteration of a building containing a flat?
Sorry, could you, I just want to be very clear on the question. So the material change of use on containing flats, why does it not require a disability access certificate?
Yeah.
So the disability access certificate requirements were updated, I think it was in 2018, where up to a certain point they were directly related to the requirement for a fire safety certificate. And then they were given their own distinct requirements, and that was done as part of this intensive look in terms of the requirements. From 2010 up to 2018 and onwards, the requirements for a DAC were related to the application of Part M in respect of the particular buildings or works. When you look at the building regulations again, the change of use to a flat does not require compliance with Part M, but specific material alterations may. And that's so in applying a DAC for such works, you'll be highlighting the specific parts where there may be a Part M requirement. But that can sometimes get lost in the detail and in comparison to the requirements of a fire safety certificate. So Part M does apply to the material alteration to give effect to such a change of use, but only where the parts that are being altered carry a Part M requirement by themselves. So it's not the building as a whole, but there does require a finesse and a specific look at what is happening, and a decision or consideration in terms of what parts apply to the works, and then those works by themselves may, if they carry a Part M requirement, have to comply with Part M. But it doesn't start at the front door. It depends on where the works occur in the building. If you voluntarily add a lift into such a building, that lift has to comply with Part M.
Yeah. So you could be
sorry, go on.
Sorry, so you could be in a position whereby a DAC is not required, but works being undertaken do need to comply with Part M.
And that may happen, but in a lot of cases, if we go back to certain reuse options, the likes of even the dwelling and the refurbishment of the dwelling, or the inclusion of an ancillary shop as part of a dwelling to create more living area, if the shop is, for whatever reason, does not want to be continued to be used as an ancillary shop, would be works in such a building that would require compliance with Part B. In fact, if there's any structural works, they require compliance with Part A. So those works by themselves have to comply with the requirements of the building regulations. They're not notifiable. They don't require a fire safety certificate, but they still need to comply. So again, the building regulations, I often like to think of it, the building regulations come first, and then the permissions come afterwards. You have to understand where the building regulations apply before you can start to determine the process of applications or notices. And when you look at the particulars of SI 496, the building control regulations, even for the fire safety certificates, there's a little line at the end that says to which Part B of the building regulations applies. So you have to determine that Part B applies first, and then requirement of the fire safety certificate, etc., can be brought to bear to support those requirements of building regulations.
Another interesting question: is there a minimum allowable square footage for flats, or is there a minimum threshold for area for flats?
There would be, but it's not under building regulations. So building regs will deal with the minimum levels of health and safety in buildings, requirements of ventilation and fire safety. There are minimum guidelines in respect of flats under planning guidelines. So yes, there are.
It kind of ties in with another question, which was if you have a typical, say, 2-story building with either a mansard roof or an A-frame roof, and you go to convert the roof into living accommodation, but you find it difficult to achieve the minimum height criteria. Aside from Part F, is there any other guidance in terms of recommended height to width ratios in terms of using a habitable space?
That's a very interesting question. Part F has recommended heights, as many of the building regulations do, related to the ventilation requirements. Again, that is a very, very specific question that I wouldn't like to answer without giving. I wouldn't like to give the wrong answer to it. But there are ways and means to achieve requirements of compliance with the building regulations. Now, it's not to say that every space can be adequately and satisfactorily converted. There has to be minimum requirements in respect of the buildings. But yeah, that is a question I'd like time to consider to get a response.
I remember myself back in the 90s, we had a rule of thumb, which from memory was either 1/3 or 2/3 needed to be above the 2.4 meter height. I have no idea if that's still valid.
Also, is that there are requirements in TGDF in respect of the heights measured off the floor and the areas that are required for minimum ventilation factors in buildings. No, certainly there is the requirement there in respect of ventilation, and it is important in terms of safety in buildings to have appropriate ventilation.
Interesting question and quite topical. Is it not the case we shouldn't cherry pick between guidance documents? We should either use technical guidance document B or 991 or 9999 or AN other. We shouldn't be cherry picking between them.
Well, from a building regulation standpoint, the minimum performances are set out in the functional requirements. And then the simple, straightforward prima facie means to achieve those requirements are set out in the technical guidance documents. So those documents deliver the required performances without having to do further examination in respect of the particulars and can be taken at face value. There is that continuing question of different documents and how different documents may apply. The base requirement is that the minimum performances as set out in the technical guidance documents are achieved. Care and consideration in the use of any other approach does need to be taken and has to be looked at not only on the fundamentals or on the particular provisions of any given document. And it's not just for Part B. There could be a similar question asked in respect of Part M or any other part, that the minimum performances that are set out have to be achieved, that the policies and philosophies have to be understood, and that the building regulations and the technical guidance documents in supporting those regulations are designed to be read as a holistic set. The 12 or the 14 documents as applicable read and are designed to work together. That the certain care does need to be taken, but from the picking and mixing approach, that's where it gets a little bit more grey, shall we say. That's the TGD sets out it's how to achieve the requirements, and when we talk about bringing back homes, keeping it simple, keeping it straightforward is optimum to the reuse of the existing buildings, and that all the necessary information is contained within the TGDs to achieve the requirements of the building regulations.
You might recollect that back in 2018, there was the Planning and Development Act came out with certain exemptions. I think it was SI 30 of 2018. That from memory was applicable up to the end of 2021. Has that been extended, or what's the status there?
There is work ongoing looking at that particular issue. My understanding is that it is going to be extended. 2025, I've heard as a date, and perhaps even expanded. I'd imagine that if it's going to be coming out fairly shortly in respect of the continuing use of the exemption regulations of 2018. But this question does come up in respect of BBH quite often. The use of the document, irrespective of what happens to those planning exemptions, but the information that is in BBH that goes beyond the planning matters for the building regs matters, for the incentives and grants matters, for other statutory matters within buildings that are brought into use is still useful. There's a very good flowchart in the back of it in respect of commencement notices and how to determine which type of commencement notice is required, and those regulations continue to apply. Those requirements haven't changed, so the document is still very useful. Even with all of that aside, it's a good book to have on top of all of the suite of technical guidance documents.
Actually, on that topic, one of our viewers asked, does the SI 30 of 2018, does it apply to a situation with a derelict shop and whether or not the space above it could be converted into an apartment or several apartments?
I think the best of my recollection is it depends on the amount, the specific use of the shop, the amount of time it's been vacant, and then its reuse options. But the general intent was that certain unused spaces could be converted to dwellings in the absence of planning permission, up to a certain number of units, 9 units. But it was written to encourage the reuse of buildings and to I suppose set aside that particular step and stage in the process. There is very specific information in BBH relating to the exemption regulations 2018, which was carefully considered in the drafting of the document by the vacant homes unit in the department.
Very good. We've got a number of questions coming in, but I'm also conscious of time. It's now just gone 8 o'clock. So if we're okay, can we keep going until maybe 5 past? Is it just take a few more questions?
Sure.
Okay with it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Pardon?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Good stuff. I'll try and read the shorter ones because the longer ones tend to be a bit of ifs, ands, and buts and maybes, and the answer may get lost in translation. But quite potentially controversial. Planners seem to have an issue with external escape stairs, but shouldn't fire safety overrule the planners?
Yeah, there can be.
I apologise.
Well, no, there will always be these nuances, especially in existing buildings, where there are competing requirements. Obviously, planners operating the Planning and Development Act have particular objectives, which is all to the good for the sustainable use and reuse of buildings in the built environment. When you couple planning requirements with heritage with building regulations, sometimes there can be, I won't say it's a conflict, but you need to find innovative solutions that can work for all. The building regulations by themselves support the use of external escape stairs as an alternate means of escape where such an alternate means of escape is required. But I can certainly understand a reluctance for their application in the built environment. Everything has a place, but it is separate and distinct to legislation. There's specific guidance given in TGGB with respect to external stairs. But it's the reuse options, as with any approval process, are taken each on the individual merits and regard by the individual local authorities.
Given that Part B is in the process of being rewritten, kind of a topical question from one of our viewers asks, why is PS 588 still being referenced? And why not 9999 or 9991? Is there an official view on this yet?
As I say, the technical guidance document is under review. That review process is ongoing and has to go through each of its steps and stages, including the public consultation. That until such time as a new document is in place, the current document still continues to have effect as being a document published by the Minister on the building regulations, and that continues to apply. That the current TGGB is the current TGGB until such time as it is replaced, and even it is typical and normal that a transitional arrangement would apply in respect of new TGGs. But the current document satisfies the requirements of the building regulations.
Very good. I'll take one more, and maybe know or don't know, maybe you can't even speculate, but is there already any plans to increase the realm of the exempted, or the list of exempted buildings or works beyond the SI 30, if it's being renewed?
I can't say with any certainty. It may be extended beyond the current range of buildings. Again, the reuse of existing buildings, identifying vacant spaces and encouraging their reuse into dwellings is a very important objective, both of the bringing back homes of housing for all under Action 20.3. So I know it is being looked at, and as I said, I'd expect there will be something coming shortly in that respect, but I couldn't say exactly what it would be.
Okay. Well, Eoin, listen, thank you very much. We appreciate all the time you put into this, but presenting and answering questions